Hello friends and welcome to Sleepy Stories. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Wherever you're listening from, whether the room around you is quiet and dark or softly lit by a lamp, this is your time to slow down. There's nowhere else you need to be. Let the day settle. Let your thoughts drift. The story will carry you. It's always a quiet kind of wonder to think about how a voice can travel, slipping through walls and windows, crossing cities and continents, arriving softly in so many different nights at once. And tonight it has arrived with you. For this evening's journey, we'll step gently back in time to a moment when history itself seemed to change its shape, not with thunder, not with a single dramatic decree, but slowly, carefully, almost quietly. We're traveling to Rome, to the turning point when the Roman Republic began its transformation into what we now call the Roman Empire. Later generations would name this era the beginning of the Principate, but at the time there was no announcement that the Republic had ended, no law openly declaring a king. The old structures still stood, assemblies still gathered, magistrates were still elected, the Senate still debated, priests still performed sacred rites, and yet something fundamental had shifted. What changed under Augustus was not the appearance of the system, but the rhythm beneath it. Decisions began to flow differently. Authority gathered around one steady center. Political rivalry did not disappear, but it was redirected, managed, contained. Power remained wrapped in republican language, but more and more, the crucial levers, military command, legislative initiative, patronage, and the quiet authority to define what counted as legitimate public business, rested in the hands of a single man. Tonight, we'll explore how that transformation happened and why so many Romans accepted it. So settle in, and let's begin. The political crisis Augustus inherited was not only the memory of Caesar's dictatorship and assassination. It was also the practical wreckage left by decades in which extraordinary commands, personal armies, and emergency finance had become normal tools. By the time Octavian emerged from the triumviral period as the last dominant war leader, Romans had lived through proscriptions, repeated civil wars, mass confiscations, and the routine use of violence as a political argument. The fact that Republican offices still existed did not mean the Republican balance of competition still functioned. In that setting, Augustus' central achievement was not the invention of new offices so much as the creation of a stable hierarchy among existing powers, combined with new administrative instruments that made that hierarchy difficult to reverse. The crucial point is that Augustus did not dismantle the Senate by formally abolishing it, or even by stripping it in one stroke of all its legal competencies. He worked instead by narrowing its room to act independently, lowering the stakes of senatorial opposition, and making senatorial status more dependent on him than on autonomous aristocratic networks. He also made himself the safest route to advancement and the essential mediator between Senate, people, and armies. That combination steadily changed what it meant for the Senate to have power. A body can retain dignities, courts, debate, and prestige while losing the capacity to decide outcomes against the will of the person who controls armed force, revenue streams, and the agenda. After Actium in 31 BCE and the capture of Alexandria in 30 BCE, Octavian held the practical reality that had undermined republican politics in the first place: a concentration of military resources. The Roman state's political system had always depended on an assumption that no single citizen could keep the loyalty of most of the legions in peacetime. In the late Republic, that assumption broke. Augustus' later constitutional settlements were designed to make the new reality look like a restoration, while keeping the decisive military imbalance. When he presented himself as ending civil war and returning legality, He was also building a set of legal justifications for continuing control over the provinces where the bulk of the army was stationed. The so-called First Settlement of 27 BCE is best understood as an agreement about provinces and commands. Octavian formally handed the Republic back to the Senate and people, then accepted a renewed responsibility for certain provinces for a term of years. The provinces assigned to him were, in broad terms, the ones requiring major military presence. Frontier zones and regions still treated as strategically unsettled. In practice, that meant that the legions were predominantly under his command, because those legions were stationed where Rome expected trouble or wanted expansion. The Senate retained provinces too, and it retained traditional magistracies that governed them, but those were mostly provinces with less immediate military concentration. Even where the Senate held provinces, Augustus' position made him the person who could ultimately intervene if he had a legal basis to do so. And he could always intervene politically through influence, precedence, and the implicit knowledge that his command was the backbone of order. From the start, Augustus cultivated the language of republican continuity. He emphasized that he was not king, not dictator, but princeps, the leading citizen. That language mattered because republican legitimacy was still a living political resource. The Senate and elite families still cared about honors, precedence, and the public claim that Rome remained a res publica. Augustus' method was to preserve those surfaces while changing the incentives underneath. He allowed elections and offices to continue, but he made it easier for them to happen safely when candidates aligned with him and harder when they did not. He allowed senatorial debate, but he shaped what could be debated and what outcomes were plausible. He allowed the people to gather in assemblies, but he moved key decisions to arenas where his initiative and veto were decisive. The Second Settlement of 23 BCE clarified the system after a crisis in Augustus' personal position, and the problem of how to maintain control without holding the consulship every year. Augustus had been consul repeatedly, which was both politically provocative and practically awkward. In 23 BCE, he stepped away from the annual consulship and instead received a set of powers that, taken together, were more flexible and less visibly republic-breaking. The two most important were tribunician power, tribunicia potestas, and a form of overarching proconsular command, imperium proconsulare, later described as greater or superior to that of other governors. Tribunician power, though historically tied to an elected tribune of the plebs, could be separated from the office and treated as a bundle of rights. The right to convene the Senate and the people, to introduce business, to block actions through veto, and to present oneself as protector of the citizen body. It also provided a convenient way to date his authority year by year in a manner that looked republican rather than monarchical. The proconsular command mattered even more for the Senate's practical power, because it provided a constitutional rationale for a standing supremacy over governors. Republican provincial government was built on the idea that governors in their provinces held imperium that was not normally subordinate to another active commander in the same space. Augustus' enhanced proconsular power turned that into a hierarchy, even in provinces not formally his. The logic of his imperium could justify intervention, especially where security or extraordinary need could be claimed. In effect, Augustus' authority became mobile. It was not trapped in one magistracy or one city boundary. It could follow the needs of the system as he defined them. This is how centralization happened without a single decree declaring it. The Senate continued to assign some provinces and to debate provincial administration. Senators still governed provinces and commanded legions in some places. Yet the overall strategic distribution of force and the legal superiority of Augustus' imperium made the Senate's provincial sphere structurally secondary. If a governor had to think about the possibility that Augustus could override him, and if the governor's future career depended on Augustus' favor, then senatorial independence existed within tight limits even when it still existed on paper. Augustus' grip on the city of Rome itself also reshaped senatorial power. In the Republic, politics in Rome was inseparable from the city's crowd, elections, riots, patronage, and the ability to mobilize supporters. Late Republican violence had shown how easily those tools could collapse into intimidation. Augustus sought to prevent rivals from building independent coercive capacity in Rome. Over time, the city developed forces that were not senatorial instruments. The Praetorian Guard, originally a protective force around the princeps, and later the Vigils, an organized urban night watch and firefighting force established under Augustus. These were not senatorial forces in the Republican sense. They answered to commanders tied to the emperor. The immediate consequence was not daily terror or visible occupation, but a change in what kinds of political confrontation were realistically possible. Senators could argue, accuse, and maneuver, but organizing armed pressure or mass intimidation against the princeps became dramatically riskier. Control of finance further narrowed the Senate's room. In the Republic, public money and contracts were arenas of elite competition, with the Senate overseeing the treasury and public revenues in broad terms. Augustus' reforms did not eliminate the older treasury, but they added imperial financial structures alongside it, and they concentrated the most politically sensitive expenditures, especially the military, under his direction. When Augustus later created a dedicated military treasury, Aerarium Militare, funded by new taxes, the purpose was not only to regularize veterans' payments and reduce the destabilizing politics of ad hoc settlements, but also to ensure that the loyalty of soldiers and veterans was tied to a system identified with the princeps. A Senate that cannot decide military pay and settlement policy independently, and that does not command most legions, is no longer the main engine of the state, even if it remains the main stage for aristocratic honor. Augustus also reshaped the Senate from within. Late Republican civil war had swollen the Senate and destabilized its composition. Augustus conducted reviews of senatorial membership and encouraged, pressured, or compelled resignations, while also elevating new men and stabilizing qualifications. This was presented as moral and institutional restoration, making the Senate worthy, numerically manageable, and dignified. In practice, it also meant that senatorial careers and status were increasingly mediated through Augustus' judgments. If membership itself could be reviewed under the princeps' influence, then senatorial identity became less an independent corporate power and more a rank within an imperial order. That did not mean the Senate became irrelevant. It remained essential as a governing instrument, especially for administration, judicial business, and elite integration. Augustus needed senators to govern provinces, command armies under his umbrella, run courts, and represent Roman authority in municipalities across the empire. The transformation was that the Senate became a partner whose functions were important but whose autonomy was constrained. It could advise, legislate through decrees that were treated as binding, and serve as a high court, but it was no longer the arena in which rival coalitions could plausibly seize control of the state through constitutional means alone, because the critical resources were no longer contestable within senatorial competition. Another mechanism of centralization was control over the political agenda. Under Augustus, formal meetings continued, but the order of business and the weight of the first proposal mattered more than open contest. Tribunician power gave Augustus the ability to convene and to bring matters forward. His personal authority, auctoritas, reinforced the expectation that his proposal would be the baseline. In practice, an institution can keep the formal right to vote while losing the practical ability to originate outcomes. Senators could still speak, but the boundaries of acceptable disagreement shifted. Open resistance could be treated not as normal politics, but as a threat to peace, stability, and the settlement that ended civil war. The language of restoration was therefore not merely propaganda. It was a political weapon that redefined opposition as disorder. Patronate networks were the social infrastructure that made this new order durable. In the Republic, patronate was dispersed among many great houses. Under Augustus, patronage did not disappear. It was reorganized around the imperial household, and the princeps' role as the leading dispenser of offices, commands, priesthoods, and honors. A senator still needed alliances, clients, and family strategies, but the top of the ladder increasingly required imperial support. That changed the behavior of ambitious men. Instead of organizing around factional senatorial competition, many organized around demonstrating reliability to Augustus and participating in a managed competition for his favor. It is in this context that one can speak of Augustus dismantling senatorial power, if the word is used carefully. He dismantled the Senate's power to set policy against him by ensuring that it did not control the decisive resources of force and finance, by embedding his supremacy in the legal structure of imperium and tribunician authority, and by making senatorial careers depend on an imperial center. He did not dismantle the Senate's dignity as an order. He used that dignity as part of the system's legitimacy. The Senate's public prestige helped make the new regime look like continuity rather than rupture, which reduced the incentive for desperate resistance and offered aristocrats a place within the new order. Everyday life for ordinary people during Augustus' era was shaped by these same political transformations, not because most people followed constitutional theory, but because the new regime prioritized predictable provisioning, urban order, and public display as foundations of legitimacy. Rome in Augustus' lifetime was a vast city by ancient standards, crowded, unequal, and dependent on continuous inflows of food, fuel, and building materials. The city's political mood could turn quickly if grain shipments failed or if bread prices rose. The late Republic had shown that popular unrest could be used by elite competitors. Augustus' regime treated food supply and public entertainment as matters of state security, and these priorities affected the daily rhythms of the urban poor as well as the business opportunities of merchants, shippers, and contractors. Food was central. The grain dole, developed through late Republican politics, continued under Augustus. It did not feed everyone in the city, and eligibility was controlled, but it represented a regularized relationship between state and citizen, a predictable distribution of staple grain to qualified recipients. That grain had to be sourced from provinces capable of producing large surplus, especially North Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia in earlier patterns, and increasingly Egypt after its annexation. The logistics were complex: collection through taxation or purchase, shipping in bulk, unloading at ports such as Ostia, storage in Horea warehouses, and distribution through administrative routines that could be audited and contested. For an ordinary recipient, this system meant that part of the household's subsistence could be planned around a known distribution, reducing the need to purchase all grain at market prices. For the urban market, it altered demand and helped limit the political volatility of food shortages. The daily diet of many urban residents was built around grain, wheat in various forms, supplemented by legumes, vegetables, fruit when available, olive oil, and cheap wine. Meat was not absent, but it was not a daily staple for most poor households. It appeared more regularly in the diets of those with higher income and status, and in the context of sacrifices and public distributions. Bread production involved milling and baking, and many city dwellers relied on commercial bakers rather than household ovens, especially in dense housing where cooking space and fuel were constrained. This created a web of urban trades: grain merchants, millers, bakers, oil sellers, tavern keepers, and carriers. Augustus Rome was therefore not only a political capital, but also a massive labor market in which survival depended on casual work, skilled craft, service labor, and the constant circulation of small coin. Housing reflected inequality sharply. Many poor and lower-middle residents lived in multi-story apartment blocks, the insulae, which could be crowded and vulnerable to fire and collapse. The better-off lived in domus houses with courtyards and more space, and the very wealthy had multiple residences, including suburban villas. In insulae life, water might be carried from public fountains, shared latrines might serve multiple households, and rents were an ongoing burden. Urban regulations existed, but enforcement varied, and speculative building could create dangerous structures. The everyday experience of a laborer or artisan household would therefore have included not only work and food procurement, but also the constant management of rent, fuel, and safety in a dense neighborhood. Public water supply, delivered through aqueducts, was one of the city's most visible infrastructures, though access and convenience varied. Aqueduct water fed fountains, baths, and some private connections. Even when a poor household lacked a private supply, public fountains provided a reliable source for daily needs. The existence of such infrastructure did not eliminate hardship, but it did shape urban patterns. Neighborhoods clustered around water points, and public bathing became a normal part of urban culture for many classes, because baths were social and practical spaces where fees could be low. Augustus' era saw continued investment in public buildings and utilities, partly as civic improvement and partly as political messaging. The visible claim that the new regime produced order, repair, and grandeur after decades of violence. Work for ordinary people was diverse and often precarious. Day labor on construction sites was common, especially during periods of intense building and renovation. Augustus' building program, which included temples, fora, and infrastructural works, generated demand for quarrying, transport, carpentry, brickmaking, plastering, and a vast chain of supply. Skilled artisans, metal workers, potters, leather workers, cloth workers, operated in workshops that ranged from family operations to larger enterprises using enslaved and freed labor. Street vending and service work were widespread. Porch-related work at Ostia and along the Tiber connected Rome to Mediterranean trade. Dock labor, warehousing, rope-making, ship repair, and the transport of goods up the river by barge. Slavery and manumission were fundamental to the labor system. Enslaved people worked in households, workshops, agriculture, and administration. Freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted, could become important economic actors, especially in trades and in roles that required literacy and business skill. The imperial household itself relied on enslaved and freed staff for many functions, which had political consequences. Access to the emperor's household network could mean influence. For ordinary freeborn Romans, the presence of slavery created both competition and opportunity. Slaves could depress wages in some sectors, but the constant buying, selling, and management of enslaved labor also generated markets, services, and pathways for freedmen to build lives in the city. Family life during Augustus' era was also a political subject, because Augustus promoted legislation and moral programs aimed at marriage, childbirth, and social order among the elite. These initiatives are often discussed as moral reforms, and they did include legal incentives and penalties related to marriage and adultery. Their practical impact varied across social groups, and enforcement was uneven. But the larger point is that Augustus sought to present his regime as restoring traditional order, and law was one tool for that presentation. For ordinary people, household formation was shaped less by ideology than by economics and status. The costs of children, the need for labor within the household, and the realities of mortality, extended kin, patron-client ties, and neighborhood connections mattered. Women's legal status depended on family arrangements and class. Elite women could have substantial wealth and influence within limits, while many poorer women worked in trades and services, including textile work, vending, and domestic labor. Religion and public ritual remained a daily presence. Augustus' political settlement was reinforced by religious restoration, temple repairs, revived priesthoods, and an emphasis on public rites that linked Roman identity to divine favor. For the average resident of Rome, this meant a calendar crowded with festivals, processions, sacrifices, and public holidays that interrupted work and provided occasions for distribution, spectacle, and social gathering. Local cults, household gods, neighborhood shrines, and professional associations with religious aspects structured community life. Participation did not require deep theological commitment. It was embedded in civic identity and routine. Augustus' policy emphasized continuity with ancestral practices, which strengthened his claim that he had repaired the state rather than replaced it. Public entertainment was not a minor detail. Games, spectacles, and festivals were major events, and they were tied to political legitimacy. Chariot racing, gladiatorial contests, theatrical performances, and public ceremonies brought large segments of the population into shared spaces where the regime could be seen and acclaimed. For ordinary people, these events were real experiences of the state's presence. The announcement of holidays, the distribution of seats, the provision of security, and the occasional distribution of food or gifts. The regime's investment in spectacle was therefore both cultural and political. It offered pleasure and distraction, but it also communicated that order and generosity flowed from the new political center. Outside the capital, the everyday experience of Augustus' rule varied enormously across Italy and the provinces, and this is part of why the Senate's altered role mattered. Most people lived in rural settings, in villages, farms, and small towns, and their contact with Augustus was mediated through local elites, municipal institutions, tax collectors, and the presence or absence of troops. In Italy, veteran settlements and land distributions had reshaped communities, sometimes violently, during the triumviral period. Under the Principate, the state aimed to reduce the recurrence of such shocks by regularizing veteran rewards and stabilizing land tenure where possible. In provinces, local city councils and elites often retained considerable autonomy in daily governance so long as taxes were paid and order maintained. For ordinary provincial subjects, the key changes were often administrative: more predictable taxation, a clearer chain of command, and a greater likelihood that appeals and petitions could be directed through imperial channels. These provincial dynamics fed back into the Senate's position. Senators remained governors and judges, but the imperial center increasingly coordinated their actions. Provincial subjects might appeal to the emperor or his representatives, and governors understood that their conduct could be reviewed. This did not eliminate corruption or abuse, but it changed the balance of fear. A governor could no longer assume that the Senate alone was the final judge of his career. In theory, this could protect provincials. In practice, it also reinforced the emperor's supremacy by making him the ultimate source of redress and discipline. The Senate's corporate power diminished as more relationships became vertical, subject to emperor, rather than horizontal within the senatorial order. In Rome itself, the political transformation showed up in the daily interaction between ordinary people and authority. Under the Republic, a citizen might seek help from patrons, appeal to tribunes, or hope to sway a magistrate through public pressure. Under Augustus, those channels still existed but were increasingly nested within imperial oversight. Tribunes continued, but tribunician power in the hands of Augustus meant the office's political role changed. Magistrates still enforced law, but the princeps' influence over appointments and precedences shaped their behavior. Petitioning became a more direct practice, because the imperial household and court network could receive and process requests. For many people, this meant that justice and favor seemed to come from a person rather than from an impersonal civic order. That perception was itself a form of centralization. At the same time, everyday life was not continuously political. Most Romans were occupied with survival, work, family, and neighborhood relations. The political order mattered most when it failed. When grain shipments were disrupted, when rent rose, when fires broke out, when crime surged, or when a new tax hit a community. Augustus' regime made its reputation by reducing the frequency and intensity of such crises in the capital, by investing in infrastructure and administrative routines, and by ensuring that the most dangerous form of politics, civil war among Roman armies, did not return in his lifetime. That stability, however, depended on the same centralization that diminished the Senate. The concentration of military command, the management of elite competition, and the integration of administrative power into an imperial center. The question of how Augustus took power from the Senate can therefore be answered in a way that does not rely on a single dramatic act. He narrowed the Senate's autonomous field by controlling most legions through provincial arrangements, by acquiring legal powers that allowed him to convene, propose, and override, by reshaping senatorial membership and advancement, by building parallel financial and administrative structures tied to his household, and by controlling the instruments of order in Rome. He then wrapped these changes in republican language and senatorial participation, so that the Senate remained honored and useful, but no longer sovereign in practice. The remaining tension, and the reason this system required constant management, was that republican form still created expectations. Senators still competed for prestige. Old families still remembered a time when the Senate could steer policy, and when ambitious men could mobilize assemblies and armies in the name of liberty. Augustus' achievement was to reduce the space in which that memory could become a program. By presenting himself as the guarantor of peace and legality, he made stability a political argument against alternatives. By keeping the Senate busy with governance, honors, and judicial work, he gave the aristocracy a stake in the new order. By providing the urban population with reliable grain distributions and visible public works, he reduced the volatility that could be exploited by rivals. And by professionalizing the linkage between state finance and the army, he made military loyalty less dependent on senatorial bargaining and more dependent on the imperial system. That is why the Augustan era feels, in hindsight, like the moment Rome moved from republic as lived practice to republic as inherited vocabulary. The Senate's words and rituals continued, and for many decades later emperors would still insist that they ruled with the Senate. But under Augustus, The routine that mattered became the routine of imperial initiative and senatorial consent, not senatorial initiative and popular ratification. For ordinary people, the most visible result was not constitutional theory, but the daily experience of a capital city, provisioned and policed by a state that increasingly spoke with one voice, distributed resources through centralized offices, and treated the stability of the urban crowd as a strategic priority. For senators, the change was more intimate. Careers, honors, and even membership were now lived within a hierarchy that could be described as restored tradition. But that functioned as a new kind of rule, with the princeps at its center, and the old republic preserved as form, language, and memory the machinery that made this new routine work was often quiet, and it operated through procedures that looked familiar to Romans even as the center of gravity moved. One way to see the change is to watch what happened to elections. In the Republic, elections were the main mechanism through which elite competition produced governing authority. Candidates courted the people in the campus martius. Alliances formed and broke in public, and the outcome could alter policy because magistrates had real initiative, and because the Senate's direction depended on who held the annual offices. Under Augustus, elections continued, but the consequences of winning changed, and the range of viable candidates narrowed. A consulship or praetorship still mattered for honor and for the career sequence, yet it mattered less as a platform for autonomous political challenge, because the most sensitive levers, major provincial commands with large armies, the initiation of the most consequential legislation, and the allocation of the most politically dangerous resources, sat within the princeps sphere. A senator could still win office and govern, but the path to the most significant assignments increasingly ran through the emperor's preferences and through the new hierarchy among provinces and commands. This did not require Augustus to stand in every election and openly dictate every result. The more common pattern was the management of expectations. Recommendations, endorsements, and informal signals carried weight in a society where patronage and precedence structured public life. When Augustus indicated support for a candidate, that support could be framed as guidance for the public good rather than coercion. Over time, many ambitious men treated imperial favor as the sensible prerequisite for candidacy. That meant fewer confrontational campaigns, fewer incentives for demagogic violence, and a calmer political calendar. It also meant that what looked like the people's free choice was increasingly filtered through a prior decision about who should be considered suitable. Even without abolishing the assemblies, Augustus could alter their function by controlling who appeared before them as a realistic option. Legislation followed a similar pattern. The Roman people still had the formal authority to pass laws in assemblies, and senatus consulta continued to be issued. But tribunician power gave Augustus the ability to bring proposals forward and to block proposals that threatened his settlement. The Senate could still debate and advise, yet the political meaning of debate changed. In the late Republic, a senatorial majority might aim to restrain a rival commander or to shape policy against a strongman, and it might succeed if the political coalition outside the Senate aligned with it. Under Augustus, the decisive question became whether the proposal aligned with the princeps' authority and with the regime's narrative of restoration. When conflict arose, it was less often resolved by an even contest among multiple centers of power, and more often by deference to the man who embodied stability and controlled the principal armed force. That shift reduced the Senate's capacity to set an agenda that contradicted imperial priorities. The Senate's own procedures were adjusted in ways that improved efficiency and dignity, while also reducing opportunities for disruptive politics. Augustus promoted reforms that regularized attendance, imposed or reinforced property qualifications, and conducted periodic reviews of membership. The nominal purpose was to restore senatorial seriousness and competence after decades in which civil war and political inflation had distorted the body. The practical consequence was that the Senate became more manageable and more dependent. If an emperor could influence who sat in the chamber, then the chamber's collective posture could be shaped in advance. Augustus could also steer discussion through smaller committees and through the influence of leading men who owed their prominence to his settlement. The Senate remained an institution of governance, but it became less like a sovereign assembly and more like a high council operating within a defined political framework. Provincial administration shows the centralization even more clearly, because this is where the army, taxation, and local society met. In the Republic, the Senate assigned provinces and commands through a yearly process, and competition for lucrative or prestigious commands was fierce. Under Augustus, provincial assignment became divided between imperial provinces and senatorial provinces. In imperial provinces, governors were appointed under Augustus' authority and acted as his representatives. In senatorial provinces, governors were still drawn from the senatorial order, but the most heavily militarized frontier regions tended to be imperial. This division was not merely administrative. It was a structural guarantee that the Senate, as a corporate body, did not command the strategic concentration of force. The Senate's governors could still do substantial work: judicial administration, tax supervision, city relations. But the zones where legions were most numerous and where military decisions could have political consequences were normally not theirs to manage independently. Taxation under Augustus was not a single uniform system across the empire, because Rome governed through an accumulation of arrangements. Provincial tribute, land taxes in some regions, poll taxes in others, customs dues, and local obligations managed by cities and communities. What changed under Augustus was not that Rome suddenly invented taxation, but that the regime's stability depended on predictable revenue and on reducing the political shocks caused by improvisation. This is where censuses and records mattered. In some provinces, notably those organized under direct Roman provincial administration, assessment could be tied to surveys and registers. Even where Rome relied on local authorities, Augustus' government benefited from clearer lines of responsibility and from the ability to intervene through governors, equestrian officials, and imperial agents. When revenue streams were stabilized, the army could be paid more predictably. Veterans could be settled or compensated without repeated emergencies, and urban provisioning could be treated as an ongoing administrative task rather than a recurring crisis. The equestrian order became more prominent in this administrative world. Senators still monopolized the highest formal offices and the most prestigious governorships, but equestrians increasingly filled roles that required technical management, financial oversight, and direct accountability to the princeps. This development did not begin from nothing in Augustus' reign. The late Republic had already seen equestrians central to finance and contracting. Under Augustus, the separation of senatorial honor from managerial office made it more plausible to place equestrians in key administrative positions without threatening aristocratic dignity. The result was a dual structure: senatorial governors in many provinces, and equestrian procurators and prefects handling finance, property, and specific administrative domains as agents of the emperor. The Senate was not only bypassed, it was encircled by a parallel chain of command that reported upward to the imperial center. Nowhere was this clearer than in Egypt. After the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, Egypt was not treated as a normal senatorial province. It was administered in a way that limited senatorial access and tied governance directly to the princeps through an equestrian prefect. The point was strategic and political. Egypt was exceptionally valuable for its grain production and its revenue, and its control mattered for the stability of Rome. By keeping it out of the normal senatorial command cycle, Augustus reduced the risk that a senator could use Egypt's resources and distance as a base for independent power. This was not merely an abstract constitutional choice. It was an operational decision about how to prevent the recurrence of late Republican dynamics, where a powerful man could build a personal regime in a rich province and then return to Italy with an army and a political program. The imperial household and court network added another layer. Roman government had always involved households because patronage, kinship, and client ties were political instruments. Under Augustus, the household became a more formal channel of state action. Enslaved and freed staff could manage correspondence, property, logistics, and access. That did not mean the state was simply privatized. It meant that in a world without a large impersonal bureaucracy, the emperor's household provided continuity, literacy, and organizational capacity. For senators, this could be unsettling because it introduced influential actors who did not belong to the senatorial order. For provincials and petitioners, it could be practical because it offered pathways to appeal and to get business heard. For Augustus, it was another mechanism of centralization because information and decisions could flow through networks he controlled personally, not only through public assemblies and senatorial debate. If one turns from institutions to the city, the same pattern appears in the management of space and risk. Rome's density created constant exposure to fire. Multi-story insulae, narrow streets, open flames for cooking and light, and the storage of combustible materials made fire a recurring danger. Under Augustus, the organization of urban security evolved toward more structured forces, culminating in the establishment of the vigils under his reign as a dedicated night watch and firefighting service. This was an administrative answer to a daily problem, but it also represented the growth of centralized authority within the city. A force tasked with policing and emergency response, organized under commanders tied to the imperial system, made order less dependent on ad hoc mobilization by magistrates and neighborhood patrons. That reduced the ability of private factions to fill security vacuums and to use disorder as leverage. The same can be said of the city's physical rebuilding and monumentalization. Augustus' building program is often remembered in slogans about transforming Rome. The more concrete reality is that construction required supply chains, quarries producing stone, kilns producing brick and tile, timber and metal supplies, transport by ship and barge, skilled and unskilled labor, contracting and site management. The organization of such projects created employment for thousands and opportunities for profit for suppliers and contractors. It also tied economic life to the political center, when public building was a major source of wages and contracts, and when the princeps was the visible sponsor of the program. Loyalty could be reinforced by work. The Senate had long sponsored public works through magistrates and private benefaction, but the scale and coordination of Augustan construction emphasized the princeps as the organizer of the city's renewal, while senators participated within the framework he defined. For ordinary people, this environment produced mixed realities. On one side were jobs on building sites, more organized urban services, and the stability of provisioning systems. On the other side were continuing vulnerabilities, high rents, the risks of fire and collapse, disease in crowded districts, and the precariousness of day labor. Even in a relatively stable regime, the urban poor lived close to subsistence. A missed week of work could mean debt. Many households relied on informal credit, on patrons, or on the combined earnings of multiple members. Children might work early, and women's labor was essential in many families, whether through textiles, market vending, food preparation for sale, or domestic service. In this economy, small coin mattered. The circulation of low-denomination coins supported daily trade. When the state's monetary policy was stable, markets could function more predictably. When it was disrupted, ordinary people felt it quickly through prices. Public baths were one of the places where different social strata encountered one another in daily routine. Bathing involved infrastructure, water supply, heating, fuel, staffing, maintenance, and it was embedded in neighborhood life. Fees could be low enough that many free residents could attend, although the quality and convenience of facilities varied. Baths were not just about hygiene. They were spaces for business talk, social visibility, and relaxation in a crowded city where private space was limited. They also represented a kind of social policy, in the sense that public amenities helped make urban density livable. Augustus' regime benefited from such amenities because they reinforced the perception that the state provided order and services. Religious life similarly organized time and public space. Temples and shrines structured neighborhoods, and festivals shaped the calendar. Augustus' emphasis on restoring temples and rites was not merely symbolic. Repairs required funding, labor, and material, and they reinforced civic identity in a city where many residents were migrants, freedmen, and provincials drawn to Rome's labor market. Public religion offered a shared language of belonging. At the same time, religious associations and collegia could function as social networks and mutual aid communities, connecting people through trade, neighborhood, or cult. These associations could be politically sensitive in earlier periods because collective organization could turn into collective action. Under the new regime, their management was part of the broader effort to maintain order while allowing ordinary social life. The question of freedom and status ran through everything. Rome's population included enslaved people, freedmen, freeborn citizens, and free provincials without Roman citizenship. Each status carried legal consequences. Enslaved people were property under law, though their lived experience varied widely depending on their work and household. Urban domestic slavery could include skilled roles, accounting, education, administration, while other enslaved people did hard labor. Manumission created freedmen who carried obligations to former owners, but could also build businesses and acquire property. Many urban trades and services were dominated by freedmen and their families. This had a direct link to Augustan politics, because the imperial household used freedmen and enslaved staff as a functional administrative layer. That fact alone changed the social geography of power, because access to influential household personnel could matter for petitions, contracts, and information. Senators could resent this, but they also had to navigate it. In the provinces, everyday life depended heavily on local structures. Rome governed through cities. In many regions, communities had councils, magistrates, and local elites who managed taxation, public works, and justice at the local level. Under Augustus, the regime encouraged and stabilized municipal administration in Italy and supported the integration of provincial elites into Roman political culture. Municipal life meant that ordinary people often encountered Rome through their city's council decisions, obligations for local building, tax collection, and the hosting of imperial cult rituals and festivals. Local elites financed games and buildings as part of their status, and this could relieve some burdens or impose others, depending on local politics. For a rural farmer, The most immediate interface with the imperial system might be tax assessment, grain requisitions in some contexts, or the need to provide labor or supplies for local public works, matters often mediated by local notables rather than by a distant Roman official. The imperial cult began to develop as a political religious framework linking the emperor to civic life, varying by region and over time. In the eastern provinces, traditions of honoring rulers and benefactors made such practices more easily integrated into existing civic religion. In the West, forms developed that tied loyalty to Rome and the emperor to new civic institutions and temples. The practical significance for everyday people was that imperial anniversaries, dedications, and ceremonies became part of the public calendar, creating new occasions for gatherings, distributions, and the display of loyalty by local elites. This was not simply brainwashing. It was an institutional bridge connecting far-flung communities to the center through ritual, honors, and the expectation that civic identity included recognition of imperial authority. The transformation of politics also shaped how justice felt. Under the Republic, elite patrons and political allies could sometimes protect someone in court, and public trials were arenas of factional struggle. Under Augustus, courts still existed and legal practice continued, but the regime's emphasis on order and the princeps' position as a final authority altered the ecosystem. Petitions could be directed upward. Governors and magistrates were more aware of the risk of review, and the emperor's example could influence what kinds of behavior were treated as tolerable. This could protect ordinary people in some instances, especially provincials subjected to abusive governors, because there was now a clearer apex of oversight beyond senatorial peer judgment. Yet it could also concentrate power in a way that made outcomes depend on imperial favor and on the accessibility of the imperial system to the petitioner. The experience of justice was therefore uneven, shaped by distance, literacy, patronage, and local power. One of the most sensitive areas where Augustus reshaped public life was the boundary between speech and security. The late Republic had been a political culture of intense public accusation, pamphleteering, satire, and rhetorical violence in courts and assemblies. Augustus did not abolish oratory and public speech, but the political meaning of speech changed. When the stability of the settlement depended on avoiding renewed civil conflict, speech that seemed to threaten legitimacy could be treated as more dangerous than it would have been in a competitive republic. Senators, equestrians, and writers navigated these boundaries. For ordinary people, the immediate effect was not necessarily censorship in everyday conversation, but a change in the public climate. Fewer overtly revolutionary political contests in the streets, fewer mass mobilizations organized by rival elite factions, and a stronger expectation that the state's peace should not be disrupted. This, too, was centralization, because it reduced the number of arenas in which alternative centers of authority could form. Succession, which Augustus could not solve by law alone, reveals the limits of his system and the ways in which centralization created new problems. In a republic, the death of a leader did not in theory threaten the constitutional order, because offices were annual and power rotated. In the Principate, the concentration of power in one person made the question of who followed him a matter of state stability. Augustus tried to manage this through family strategy, marriages, adoptions, and the promotion of potential heirs through offices and honors. The intention was to provide continuity without openly declaring a monarchy. Yet the repeated deaths of likely heirs forced revisions and created tension within the elite. For ordinary people, succession might be distant until it produced uncertainty, rumors, or instability in markets and military deployments. For senators, Succession was an arena where they might hope to regain influence, but it was also an arena where miscalculation could be fatal, because backing the wrong candidate could be treated as a threat to peace. The very fact that succession became a central political question was itself proof that the republic's routine had been replaced. In Augustus' lifetime, the system held because he was skilled at balancing honors and constraints. He understood that a Senate stripped too visibly of dignity might become desperate, and he understood that an urban population denied bread and public life could become volatile. He also understood that the army required regularity, pay, discharge terms, veteran settlements, and clear command structures. The Principate's political logic can be followed through these themes as they recur: logistics of food and building supplies, finance of military and public works, administration through governors and equestrian officials, information flow through household networks and petitions, and law as both a practical tool and a language of legitimacy. Each theme is a channel through which Republican forms could remain while decision-making became imperial routine. Consider the soldier and the veteran, because this is where politics, finance, and everyday life intersect. A professionalizing army meant long service and a clearer expectation of rewards at discharge. Veterans could be settled in colonies or compensated in ways designed to reduce the social trauma of confiscations that had accompanied earlier Civil War settlements. For an Italian farmer near a veteran colony, this could still mean land pressure and social change, because colonies reorganized local economies, introduced new civic institutions, and shifted patterns of landholding. For the veteran, it meant a chance to establish a household and a livelihood with a recognized legal status. For the regime, it meant a long-term stabilizing investment. Soldiers who saw their future tied to a predictable system, identified with the princeps, were less likely to become the tools of rival commanders. Trade and transport continued to tie the empire together, and Augustus' political settlement benefited from the fact that Mediterranean connectivity could move bulk goods at scale. Merchant shipping, port labor, warehousing, and river transport on the Tiber were not just economic activities. They were the physical foundation of Rome's political stability. When grain arrived reliably, urban unrest diminished. When oil, wine, and other staples flowed, markets functioned. This encouraged investment in port facilities and storage. It also created social strata in the city whose livelihoods depended on the imperial system working. Shippers, contractors, warehouse managers, and the many laborers whose wages depended on the movement of goods. Their daily life was shaped by the calendar of arrivals, the hiring rhythms at docks and building sites, and the fluctuating availability of work. The Senate, watching this world, could recognize that it still mattered, yet it could also recognize that it no longer monopolized the state's most critical arteries. Senators might preside over courts, govern provinces, and debate policy, but the regime's stability rested on a set of managerial and coercive capacities that Augustus held together. In that sense, the rewriting of Roman politics was not simply a story of constitutional formulas. It was a story of how an empire of cities, roads, ports, taxes, and armies was made governable after civil war by centralizing responsibility for peace in a single office holder who could present that centralization as restoration. The Republic remained a vocabulary of legitimacy, and the Senate remained a prestigious order, but the practical routine of governance now ran through the princeps, whose power was felt not only in laws and decrees, but in the ordinary fact that food arrived. Fires were fought, soldiers were paid, and careers advanced within a hierarchy that no longer depended on the unpredictable violence of factional competition. And within the neighborhoods of Rome, The new routine was experienced in small, repeated encounters. Standing in line for distributions if one was eligible, buying bread from a baker using small coin, hauling water from a public fountain, seeking day work on a building site, paying rent to a landlord or agent, visiting a bathhouse where news and rumor moved quickly, watching a festival procession pass through streets that were increasingly organized by public works and controlled by emerging urban forces, hearing the names and titles of Augustus embedded in calendars, monuments, and civic ceremonies. For most people, the rewriting of politics was not a debate about whether the republic still existed. It was the gradual recognition that the state's visible generosity and its visible order had a new center, and that this center had become the place where petitions went, where careers were made, where the army's loyalty was anchored, and where the public peace was claimed as a personal achievement. In Rome's political culture, the Senate's power had always depended on more than formal votes. It depended on controlling the flow of commands, honors, and resources, and on being the place where the future of ambitious men was decided. Under Augustus, those flows were redirected. The Senate still met and still produced decisions, but the most important thing increasingly happened before the meeting began: the formation of consensus around what the princeps wanted, and the quiet recognition that certain outcomes were not on the table. That recognition was built from several practical realities that senators could not ignore. Most legions were stationed in provinces under Augustus' command. The most sensitive revenue streams and the most politically dangerous expenditures were managed through imperial channels. Access to prestigious posts depended heavily on imperial recommendation, and the city's security increasingly rested on forces whose loyalty ran to the emperor's system rather than to annual magistrates. That did not mean senatorial life became purely ceremonial. Senators continued to do real work, especially in judicial matters and in the governance of senatorial provinces. A senator's identity was still tied to speaking in the Senate, to the management of property, to the patronage of clients, and to the pursuit of honors. But the nature of risk changed. In the late Republic, a senator might gamble everything on factional conflict because victory could mean command, wealth, and dominance. Under Augustus, the safest path was cooperation because the penalties for being seen as destabilizing could be severe, while the rewards for being seen as reliable were plentiful and steady. A system that makes cooperation rational does not need constant visible coercion to centralize power. The Senate's own membership reforms were part of this. Periodic revisions reduced numbers and reinforced property qualifications and moral expectations. The stated aim was restoration, a Senate that looked dignified, disciplined, and worthy of leading the state. The effect was a Senate whose boundaries could be influenced by the emperor, and whose internal hierarchy was shaped by imperial favor. It also changed the social composition of the ruling class. New men from Italy and the provinces could rise more predictably through imperial patronage. That created a broader base of elite support for the regime and diluted the capacity of a small set of old families to act as an independent corporate bloc. Over time, senatorial rank became both a badge of ancient prestige and a credential within an imperial order, where advancement depended less on volatile electoral struggle and more on a managed sequence of appointments. The annual magistracies remained, but their practical function shifted. Consuls and praetors still entered office, presided over courts and ceremonies, and could sponsor public works or games. Yet their space to initiate major policy was narrower, because Augustus held tribunician power and controlled much of the agenda. The Roman people still voted in assemblies, but assemblies were increasingly arenas for ratifying what elite consensus had already accepted. The system did not openly insult the people's sovereignty. It minimized occasions when sovereignty could be used against the regime. This helps explain why Augustan propaganda, in the broad sense of public messaging through monuments, inscriptions, coin designs, and ritual, emphasized not novelty but continuity. The regime's language presented the civil wars as a rupture that had now been repaired. It framed Augustus' authority as a service performed on behalf of the res publica. That framing did real political work because it made dissent appear not like normal competition, but like a step back toward chaos. The Senate, which remembered the costs of chaos, had reasons to accept this. So did many ordinary Romans, whose livelihoods were threatened by instability in grain supply, employment, and urban safety. The management of Rome's grain supply is one place where the regime's administrative capacity became visible without needing constant political speeches. The city relied on bulk shipments from across the Mediterranean, especially from regions capable of producing enormous surpluses. Those shipments required predictable scheduling, protection against loss, storage capacity, and distribution procedures. Ships had to be built, crews hired, cargoes insured or at least financially backed, contracts arranged, and unloading managed at ports where congestion could turn into delay. Warehouses had to be maintained and guarded. The Tiber traffic and the port infrastructure around Ostia and its approaches had to handle seasonal peaks. Any serious failure could quickly become political unrest in the capital. When Augustus' regime invested in making these systems more reliable, the effect on daily life was immediate. Markets were less likely to experience sudden scarcity. Eligible recipients of distributions were less likely to face breakdowns in the expected routine. Work at docks and warehouses became more regular. The regime did not have to announce every operational improvement. The city's stability itself was the announcement. The organization of the urban population was also tied to the control of space. Augustus' Rome was a city of neighborhoods with their own social fabric, often structured around street corners, fountains, shrines, workshops, and taverns. People knew the patterns of their district, which baker sold cheapest, where day laborers gathered, which bathhouses were accessible, where to find a patron's agent, where the night watch passed. Urban order was therefore not only a matter of law. It was a matter of routine patrols, the regulation of gatherings, and the presence of public services that could keep emergencies from becoming political crises. A fire left uncontrolled could consume blocks and displace thousands. A riot at a distribution point could become a signal of regime failure. An organized watch and firefighting response reduced the chance that such incidents would spiral. That is why the growth of organized urban forces mattered politically, even when they were not used as overt instruments of repression. Employment tied into this order. Construction and maintenance were constant in a city where buildings deteriorated quickly, where fires and collapses demanded rebuilding, and where political legitimacy was reinforced through public architecture. Large projects drew in labor at every level: quarrying, transport, stone cutting, brickmaking, carpentry, metalwork, plastering, painting, and hauling. The state's willingness to fund and coordinate projects stabilized a segment of the urban labor market. At the same time, many people lived with irregular income. They might work 2 or 3 trades seasonally. They might rely on a patron's occasional assistance or on loans from neighbors. They might depend on the earnings of children or on the work of women in textiles and sale of prepared foods. The idea of an Augustan golden age did not mean comfort for all. It meant fewer systemic shocks, more predictable administration, and an elite culture that invested heavily in the appearance and functioning of the capital. The everyday economy was sustained by a dense ecology of small transactions. Street vendors sold bread, oil, fruit, cooked dishes, and cheap wine. Workshops produced pottery, lamps, tools, and clothing. Porters moved goods through narrow streets. Notaries and scribes provided literacy services for those who could pay. Taverns, inns, and lodging houses served migrants and the transient workforce. The city absorbed newcomers constantly, freedmen seeking opportunity, provincials connected to merchants or patrons, and rural poor pushed by land pressures. That migration helped explain the regime's preoccupation with order and provisioning. A large, mobile population made Rome both economically dynamic and politically sensitive. Status distinctions shaped daily experience as sharply as money did. A freeborn Roman citizen had rights that a non-citizen provincial did not, and a freedman had a different social position than a freeborn citizen, even when he became wealthy. Enslaved people lived under legal constraint, but could hold skilled roles and manage significant responsibilities within households or enterprises. These distinctions mattered in court, in marriage arrangements, in inheritance, and in access to certain honors. Under Augustus, the state's emphasis on moral legislation and social order among the elite created a public conversation about family, marriage, and sexual conduct. But the practical relevance for many ordinary people remained shaped more by economic reality. A household strategy depended on survival, securing income, managing rents, maintaining kin ties, and navigating patronage networks. Women's work across classes was foundational. In elite households, women could manage estates and finances within the constraints of family law and social expectation, and they could influence networks through marriage alliances and patronage. In non-elite households, women commonly contributed to income through textile production, market selling, food preparation for sale, and domestic service. Their labor was part of what kept families afloat in a city where wages could be irregular. Children, too, often contributed, whether through apprenticeships, errands, workshop labor, or vending. These were not unique to Augustus' era, but the stability of the Principate provided an environment in which family strategies could be planned with slightly more predictability than during the years of civil war. The same logic applied in the countryside. Most of the empire's population lived outside large cities, working land in arrangements that ranged from smallholders to tenant farmers on great estates. Rural life was shaped by harvest cycles, local markets, and obligations to landlords and tax systems. In Italy, patterns of landholding and labor had been altered by decades of war and confiscations before Augustus stabilized things. Large estates worked by enslaved labor and by tenant arrangements existed alongside small farms. Rural debt, land pressure, and the attraction of city wages could push people toward towns and Rome. Under Augustus, state stability did not reverse these long-term structural pressures, but it reduced the likelihood that a new round of civil war would suddenly sweep through with confiscations and forced migrations on the same scale as before. In the provinces, the presence of the army created a distinct economic landscape. Permanent or semi-permanent garrisons demanded food, fodder, clothing, weapons, and building materials. That demand generated markets, contracts, and opportunities for suppliers. Around camps, civilian settlements could grow, mixing soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, and families. The army's pay injected coin into local economies, and the need for regular supply created transport corridors and administrative routines. For local communities, this could be both a burden and an opportunity. Requisitions and obligations could strain resources, but contracts and sales could also bring profit. The emperor's control of military deployment thus shaped everyday life on frontiers, where roads were maintained, where warehouses were built, where towns grew, and where tax burdens were felt. This military economy also helps explain why Augustus' political centralization endured. In the Republic, a general could use an army's loyalty as a lever against the Senate, because soldiers' futures depended on their commander's ability to secure rewards. Augustus' regime sought to make those rewards depend on the system rather than on a rival. Regular service terms, predictable pay, and planned veteran benefits reduced the space for ambitious generals to present themselves as the only route to justice for soldiers. This did not eliminate the possibility of military politics forever, but in Augustus' lifetime it strengthened the link between stability and the imperial center. Information flow, another recurring theme, was equally important. A vast empire required communication, orders to governors, reports from provinces, financial accounts, and petitions. In the Republic, information moved through senatorial networks, magistrates, and private correspondence. Under Augustus, those channels remained, but the imperial household became a hub. Correspondence and petitions could be handled by staff whose continuity outlasted annual office terms. Governors understood that their reports might be read and acted on directly by the emperor's circle. Municipal elites could seek decisions by appealing upward. This created a sense, sometimes accurate and sometimes not, that the emperor's attention could reach anywhere. The reality was more uneven, shaped by distance and the capacity of local patrons to carry a case forward. But the structure itself centralized authority because it placed the emperor at the top of the information hierarchy. In Rome, the social geography of power became visible in access. People sought access to the emperor's household, to his friends, to those who could place a petition in the right hands. Senators had their own client crowds, but they too had reasons to maintain access to the imperial center. This did not mean the city became a simple court society overnight. It meant that the old republican competition for office and command was increasingly complemented, and sometimes displaced, by competition for proximity and influence within the imperial network. Senators could still be powerful in their own neighborhoods and among their dependents, but the ultimate arbitration of disputes and ambitions increasingly ran upward. At the same time, Augustus had to manage the symbolism of not being a king. He lived in a society with a strong cultural memory of expelling kings and a political tradition in which overt monarchy was dangerous. His solution was to accumulate powers that were republican in origin: tribunician authority, proconsular imperium, the prestige of repeated honors, while presenting himself as the first among citizens. Titles and honors were chosen carefully. The point was not mere vanity. It was the political engineering of legitimacy, to make the regime's centralization appear as the necessary guardian of a restored republic. This engineering was visible in the way Augustus positioned the Senate. He consulted it, honored it, and allowed it to act in ways that sustained its dignity. Senatorial decrees remained important. Senatorial courts continued. High offices retained luster. Yet when key decisions touched the regime's foundation, military command, major provincial arrangements, the stability of the capital's provisioning, and the management of elite rivalry, the imperial center's preference defined the acceptable range. The Senate could advise and administer. It could not plausibly reclaim sovereignty without shattering the settlement and returning to the conditions that had produced civil war. Ordinary people did not think in terms of sovereignty, but they were sensitive to whether the city worked. They knew whether grain was affordable, whether wages were available, whether streets were safe at night, whether fires were controlled, and whether public festivals and baths remained part of life. They also knew whether the state's presence was predictable or arbitrary. Under Augustus, the regime's success depended on replacing arbitrary shocks with routine. The paradox is that this routine was maintained by centralization, by turning the emperor into the guarantor of supply, order, and the smooth functioning of institutions that still wore republican names. The system's limits could also be felt. Even with improved administration, famine could still threaten if harvests failed or shipping was disrupted. Disease could still spread in crowded quarters. The hazards of insular living did not vanish. Inequality remained stark. Enslaved people remained vulnerable to the decisions of owners. Provincial taxpayers could still experience heavy burdens. Governors could still abuse power. Augustus' regime did not create a modern state with uniform rights and services. It created a more stable imperial order whose stability depended on the managed cooperation of elites and on the continuous delivery of key urban necessities. The Senate's transformation, then, is best understood as a change in what the Senate was for. Under Augustus, it became less a sovereign directing body and more an aristocratic instrument integrated into a larger system. It supplied personnel and legitimacy. It adjudicated and administered. It represented tradition, but it no longer provided the primary arena in which competing centers of force could contend for control of the state. That arena moved to the imperial center, where military command, fiscal control, administrative staffing, and agenda setting were concentrated in the person and household of Augustus, all while the familiar structures of republican life remained standing like an older facade around a new set of load-bearing supports. By the later years of Augustus' reign, the new routine had become ordinary enough that it could be mistaken for tradition. That was the regime's intended outcome. The Senate still wore its old clothing of dignity. The rituals of meeting, the hierarchy of speaking order, the prestige of consular rank, the assignment of honors, the standing of great families, and the visible continuity of republican offices. Yet the fundamental conditions that had made the Senate sovereign in the Middle Republic were no longer present. Sovereignty had once depended on the Senate's ability to coordinate magistrates and to steer provincial commands in a world where no single citizen could reliably monopolize force. Under Augustus, force was coordinated through the princeps command structure, and the legal settlement made that coordination appear constitutional. The Senate's loss of independent power can be summarized through the practical levers Augustus held at once. First, the distribution of provinces ensured that the largest concentrations of troops were under his command. Second, his tribunician authority and superior imperium gave him the ability to convene, propose, and when necessary, override or supersede. Third, the evolution of financial administration created imperial channels for the most sensitive expenditures, especially those tied to the army and the stability of the capital. Fourth, the control of careers and honors meant that the Senate's internal competition was increasingly mediated by imperial recommendation and by the expectation of cooperation. Fifth, the growth of urban security forces and organized services in Rome reduced the city's dependence on ad hoc elite mobilization and made disorder easier to contain without empowering rival factions. None of these levers required a formal abolition of the Senate's legal competencies. That was precisely the point. Augustus' centralization worked best when it did not look like a rupture. Senators could still imagine themselves as governing, and in many administrative and judicial matters they truly did govern. But when politics approached the regime's foundations, army, revenue, and public order, the system was built so that the Senate's initiative could not easily become an alternative center of rule. For everyday people, the same settlement was experienced less as constitutional engineering and more as the daily reliability of systems that had been volatile in living memory. Rome's urban population could measure stability in grain distributions, in price behavior at markets, in the steady availability of work generated by building and maintenance, in the management of fire and street order, and in the predictable rhythm of festivals and public amenities. Those measures did not erase hardship. Most households still lived close to the edge, with rent pressure, irregular wages, and the constant vulnerabilities of crowded housing. Enslavement remained a central institution, and legal status shaped opportunity at every level. Yet the reduction of civil war as a recurring threat and the strengthening of urban administration changed what many people could reasonably expect from the state. In Italy and the provinces, ordinary life continued to be governed by local structures, city councils, landlords, patrons, markets, and the seasonal logic of agriculture. While imperial power was most often encountered through taxation, judicial oversight, military presence, and civic ritual that tied communities to the center, the emperor's reach was not uniform, but the direction of authority was clearer than in the late Republic. The possibility of appealing upward, the growing presence of imperial agents alongside senatorial governors, and the integration of local elites into an imperial hierarchy all reinforced the sense that the empire now had a single apex. The Augustan settlement also created its own enduring problem: succession. Because the system concentrated decisive authority in one person while maintaining republican language, it could not easily define, in purely legal terms, who should inherit that authority. Augustus managed the transition as best he could through adoption, family strategy, and the public elevation of an heir within existing offices and honors. The fact that so much depended on managing this issue shows how thoroughly the Republic's old routine had been rewritten. When Augustus died, the question was not whether the Senate would resume sovereign control in the old way. It was whether the imperial routine would continue under a new princeps without breaking into factional violence. That is the core of how assemblies, magistracies, the Senate, and patronage networks changed function under Augustus while retaining republican forms. The assemblies still met but increasingly ratified rather than originated. Magistracies still existed but operated within a narrower sphere of initiative. The Senate still deliberated and administered, but did so inside a hierarchy anchored by imperial control of armies, finance, and agenda. Patronage still structured society, but increasingly flowed through a dominant center whose favor mattered most. The visible republic remained, but it became a language and a set of ceremonies wrapped around a new operational reality, an imperial system designed to prevent the return of civil war by making peace, provisioning, and careers depend on a centralized authority that could be presented, plausibly enough for many contemporaries, as the restoration of order rather than the invention of kingship.